a joy to have those of you who are streaming in this evening and those who are here in person. Sadly, we couldn't accommodate everyone, one, because of COVID, but because the rooms were just booked. And this was the room that we were given. But I do see something incredibly divine in us being together, both in this setting of intimacy, and also to have those of you streaming in. Some of you are in groups. There's classes that are watching this as a group. All together, regardless of the technology, we are community. We're bonded through love. And so I thank you for taking the time, from some of you from your schedules of preparing for exams and essays, to take some time to be present, to members of our community, that we will try our very best this evening to honor and value for their contributions to our world and our communities. The so-called recent attacks on members of the AAPI community, the Asian diaspora, for those who live this, is not new. There are many systematic laws that have been constructed to hurt members of the Asian diaspora in this country and beyond. And in our small way, we are joining our members of the AAPI community by standing up and saying, we stand in solidarity with you. We do not speak for you. We do not assume that we lived your experience or are living your experience. We invite you to speak your truth on your own terms. We will not translate. We will not justify. We will, though, acknowledge. Acknowledge what you bring to the table. There is no doubt that it is an incredible amount of teamwork that brings this moment together. And in honoring of those precious individuals, I will name them because they too matter. It is a village that creates such forums. So what we do by acknowledging their names is that we recognize that individuals don't stand by themselves, that we are part of the we, not the I, myself, and I. So I want to thank a number of people, one being, I'm going to start with my beloved TAs and student workers, Carly Watchorn, Jocelyn Leafman, and Ben Anderson, Maddie Antikainen, and Crystal Besterling. I also want to thank Bethel Print Services for the many ways that they serve our community, and they produce these excellent posters for us. I want to thank Susie Nelson, our wonderful administrative assistant. I want to thank Lizzie Carson, holler Lizzie, a reconciliation studies and nursing major, also recipient of this year's, one of the recipients of this year's Servant Leadership Award. And she has assisted me today so beautifully. I want to thank Avis Soderstrom, the Director of Conference and Event Services, who has assembled and manages this incredible team of those who are part of conferences and event services. I want to give a special thank you for Erica Smithy, who has just helped me to navigate the many details that come with presenting such a forum in this COVID era. I want to thank Kerry Baker, Manager of Conference and Events and Technical Services, and Alex Schaefer. And I want to thank back there, Andrea Hendricks, for just your beautiful presence and just calm in the midst of the storm. Thank you. I want to thank Chloe Rodriguez. You've got a lovely, beautiful array of people here. And Katie Fries, thank you so much for all your help. I want to thank our custodians who are fierce, okay? So I want to thank Paige King, the second shift lead custodian supervisor of facilities management, Beth Dissinger, who helped find a flatbed cart from somewhere. Seriously, there's a secret stash somewhere, and we got it. There was a God, okay? So, and I want to thank the Tedesco team, Bob Schuhart and Al Nigard, who just helped to honor Kao Kalia Yang in such amazing ways. I want to thank my faculty team, Dr. Robin Bell, Dr. Tandem Brecky, and Professor Mark Jensen for, again, bringing their extraordinary expertise, love for people, knowledge, and passion for reconciliation. We are blessed to have many of our executive leaders here. And trust me, I and my team do not take it for granted because there are much that you can do. And I want Kao Kalia Yang and our members of the AAPI community to know just what it means for us to say, our executive leaders are conveying by being here that you matter.
Yeah.
And so I want to first of all thank President Ross Allen for being here, and Annie Allen being here, sort of not being here, but she is here in spirit. We can agree with that. I want to thank Robin Lerstam. I sweat with these names, okay? Who's the University Provost. Dr. Julie Finnan, who is the Associate Provost for the College of Arts and Sciences. And Dr. Barrett Fisher, I always say he's my boss. He doesn't like when I say that, but it is what it is. And he's the Dean of Academic Programs and for colleges and sciences. I want to encourage those students who want to engage with Slido, that you can do that throughout the event, and we will collate the questions, and then we will engage with them in the roundtable session of this evening. The Slido code is AAPI 2021. AAPI 2021. So that one more time. AAPI 2021. We will ask that you do not record this evening's event. Thank you very much. And we also ask that you don't take any screenshots for this evening. After the introduction of our guest contributors and conversation partners, the evening will begin with prayer. One in Hmong and English and one in Karen. Our wonderful Bethel student, Pei Po, will pray in Karen. And let me say, there will be no English translation of this prayer. And the reason why we're doing this is that it gives us an opportunity to receive a blessing of prayer in another language. And we are inspired by Alice Hong's mother, and Alice Hong is a fierce woman in her own right, a recent awardee of a Servant Leadership Award. And Alice Hong in that evening shared her, was surprised when her mother was recorded because she couldn't be there because of COVID, and we only had so many people in the room, but was able to express her love for her beloved daughter. No one spoke beyond Alice, Korean, but we were so blessed by your mother's voice, your mother's truth, her ability to articulate herself on her own terms. Amen. And so we are inspired by your mother, and we do this in honor of her. Kao Kalia Yang will give a 40-minute presentation, We'll have a 10-minute interval. And then our contributors to the roundtable will share their stories, their lives, their agencies, their experiences of confronting anti-Asian violence. The members of the board of the roundtable are as follows. Mary Seller, or Mary Jean, who is the Urban Farm and Garden Alliance co-coordinator. Bang Hua, who is our Associate Dean of Diversity and Intercultural Engagement. Dr. Vernon Lee, professor of Hebrew Bible. Let me just take a pause there, because let me just tell you right now, Dr. Bernard Lee is one of our intellectual giants here. I just need to put that out there. And so it is an absolute gift to have you here and an honor to have you here, Dr. Bernard Lee. Pastor Paul Kong, who is Associate Campus Pastor for Cultural Engagement, a wonderful human being, truly. Tulor Epa, who is an Acts scholar. Ekena, or many of us call her Da. Zar, who is a 2018-19 Executive Director of UCB, United Cultures of Bethel, and now graduated and looking fierce, I may add. Okay? When people that look that good when they leave Bethel, you start getting worried, okay? and then there is Alice Hong, the current executor of the United Cultures of Bethel. So now let me draw attention to introducing you to Kao Kalia. I'm just going to put this out there. Yeah, this is going to take a little bit of time, but it's worth it, okay? Because right now I'm going to say, quite honestly, that Kao Kalia is, and now I can say was on my bucket list. I'm all good. I'm not going to die tomorrow. Y'all relax, okay? I'm just going to be grading your papers and all the rest of it. But this is Kao Kalia is an extraordinary talent, an extraordinary author, an extraordinary storyteller. Her brilliance is breathtaking. She embodies the oral tradition through written words that doesn't compromise the oral tradition, but allows us to remember of the deep, fathomless wisdoms that come out of the oral tradition. She is an extraordinary poetic voice. The publication for Library Journal announces that Yang powerfully demonstrates that much of what society doesn't hold valuable, talents that don't translate into monetary or educational success, still carry immense value. Kao Kalia is a Hmong American writer, filmmaker, and teacher. She is also a co-founder of Words Wanted, a company dedicated to helping immigrants with writing, translating, and business services. Her work is passionate and eloquent as she seeks to deepen the understanding of the human condition in order to garner more compassion in the world. Kalia was born in the refugee camps of Thailand to a family that escaped the genocide of the secret war in Laos. She came to America at the age of 6, and her first book, The Late Homecomer, a Hmong family memoir, reflects upon this move. A review by Publishers Weekly praises Kalia Yang by saying Yang tells her family's story with grace. She narrates their struggles beautifully, weaving in Hmong folklore and culture. The Late Homecomer was the winner of 2 Minnesota Book Awards, a finalist for the PEN USA Award, and earned a NEA Big Red title. It is the first Hmong-authored book to gain national distribution from a literary press. Can we give just... Her memoir, The Song Poet, a memoir of my father. I have some students who are in my class and have read. This is a book of genius. It won the 2016 Minnesota Book Award, was finalist in the Dayton's Literary Peace Prize, the National Book Critics Circle Award, the PEN USA, and so many more. There are her books, her children's books, I would argue you should all read. But some of them, Young Warriors, A Map into the World, The Most Beautiful Thing, and one that's forthcoming, From the Tops of the Trees. Oh my God, what a title, right? Kao Kalia, when not in front of an audience, inspiring social change and awareness, raises twin sons that keep her and her husband busy at their home in Minneapolis. But I also want to spotlight a book that I think is incredibly important, where she has co-edited a book that gathers the stories of women from women of color and Native women who have dealt with miscarriages and infant loss. That book is entitled What God is Honored Here. Writings on miscarriages and infant loss by and for Native women and women of color. This is a very timely and important book, as you know, since many Black women and Native women, the extraordinary rates of death for their children and themselves is unprecedented in terms of the lack of care they receive. It's important to collect these stories. There are not enough words to describe the impact of Kao Kalia's visionary storytelling and skills as a writer. Her book, The Song Poet, a memoir of my father, has left many of my students and I speechless. During one of our class sessions, my students and I cried because Kao Kalia's telling of the experiences of her father, Bi Yang, so moved us. Readers from different walks of life, social backgrounds, beliefs, and convictions have been inspired to consider how their own family and cultural stories shaped them. Last semester, my students and I watched Kao Kalia's father, Bi Yang, sing his song poetry. Only one individual, our beloved Bang Moa, could understand what your father shared. But somehow as a class, we could connect with and receive the power of his sentiments, his emotions, the cadences of histories that permeated his poetic storytelling, his song poetry. I cannot look at the cover of the Song Poet without remembering that the tape cassette also channels the many stories, the many songs that were sent by relatives to continue to forge connection. Because of Bang Moa, now I can know that because you educated us. Thank you. The Song Poet, as well as and all the works of Kao Kalia, but I have to say the Song Poet for me presents us with two opportunities. One, to engage with one of the most extraordinary interpretations and descriptions and portrayals of marriage in track 4. That's all I can say to people. Read track 4. Your work is significant. Your words allow us to be fully human without apology. Your words enable us to embrace the complexity of our humanity. Your words call us to pay attention. Your words honor sacred presence. Your words give us the privilege to learn from you, your beloved father, Bi Yang, your other family members, and your community. Thank you. Thank you. Prayer. Can we move to prayer, please? April?
All right, let's pray. Fire Pisibang to Podoma, Medile, Neepwa, Nepamupwa, Nisupwa, Dot Nepata Quetaya, Lepo Mubadi, Tabaka, Umubat Diller, KE, Had of Sectonaria, or Dabudomanino. I saw you healer and kilo Badapwa, little direct tackle Burnia E. Salala Akoti, Akatha, Akata, Kalewa Takiba, Dot, do Platon alone a bog, Masabaniki. Dengan masa bapa le kebat tera sirpa, tasir lag tu lu hera wara sirpa, kemi dah yang kau belum na, dok ke tota kita ba le ba do na ta phwa go ma se ba ni ke le ma se ba se ko pa ko ga de le hele ha ro se to na we I le ru ma pu we me ge le hele ke li la me ge ne ko otho ba su sa ne ko otho ba na de to ke na hu we do ke le ba pa kha do pa ge do ko omu ge tho de to pa nyo de ga go ma se ba ni ke do ti nya so a we se ki ni we da ta si ta to ti pha do ko omu ma la bon bin pu a tha go ma se ba se ko ni dar ka ba ma se ba se ko pa ko ga de le tha lo se to na we I ta mo ni sa lo si pha we da a ma de ga le a se na lo ga we so ki a we se ta mo ni sa lo le ba tha la mi ge ko te pe mi ge mi ke so ki ma le ma we ba ki se ko ni ke do ta le yi khi na se pha lo tu la ka se pha mo o ma le ma we ba ki se ko ni ki pe ki bwa do pe ki pa da ta ra ta ke ka we I so ki bwa le khu ta do bwa khi na te mi le mi da ta ta lo ba khi na ko bu le no po pa ke se su
Thank you. Yes.
I will be saying a prayer in a Hmong and in English as well. I'll start with the Hmong. Con chỉ biểu cái cháu của chính cháu bé to kia nó. Giờ giờ mới em mình nhau bé tới chơi nó văn chuyện nó. Em trên tại cái giờ thì thay bé. Cái giờ những tổ bé tới cái cháu bé kia nó. Con chỉ bé cho xã hội có chỉ hay nó. Bây giờ thay bé cho lúc đó. Cái lại kinh nó vậy. Mình share này cho chú ý chụp bé. Để bé cởi tóc. Bé có cháu có chỉ cho mình chụp bé nó. Mà chú thọ đại sĩ hay nó chụp bé lúc còn kia có bé. Cái lúc cứ bây giờ sĩ hay rồi chua. Lúc ban đầu bé ở trong ninh trong trang, ở trong ninh lúc trong này có vật chuyện. Thọ có sang trong bé cho bé kia. So God, we come before you and we thank you for the ability to gather during a time where it's very difficult because of the pandemic. We appreciate this time to hear, the sacred time. God, we pray for your protection over us. We pray for your hand of healing to be with us. That you be with us this night, during this time. And we thank you for bringing Kalia Yang here. You share her wisdom with us. That her words that we can grow and that we can become more like you, God. May the words that we say be like medicine poured upon each other to bring healing reflection upon our reflection. That God, we can look more like you. So that we could be a community that continues to understand and press into areas that can be difficult. God, we come before you to ask for your strength, to ask for your wisdom, ask for your guidance during this time. In the name of Christ, I pray. Amen.
And so with that, for those who are able, could you stand up and give our honored guest a round of applause for Kao Kalia.
Thank you for your beautiful prayers. Dr. May, thank you for your generous and poetic introduction. I want to thank all of you for being here today, those who are watching virtually, and then those of you in the room. This is my first adventure out in over a year. What a reason to come, and what a place and space to enter. For those of you who know my story, you know that I never sought out to become a writer. Like generations before me, newcomers to America, immigrants and refugees, we were taught that we needed doctors and lawyers to survive in this country. The doctors heal what is broken in the bodies that love us. The lawyers protect the rights that we've never had enough of. So like so many children before, I thought I might become a doctor. I'm the descendant of 3 shamans. Shamanism is it's a calling. It's not a choice. And that was what I thought I was going to do. I went to Carleton College to learn American studies, cross-cultural studies, women and gender studies on the pre-med track because I thought a good doctor had to be able to see from many different angles. I had no idea that that would become exactly the training I would need to stand as a writer. My journey into writing is not common. I belong to an old woman, my grandmother Jolie, who had never been to school, who signed her name with a shaky X. My grandma who could read the wind and the rain and the clouds in the sky, the things growing from the earth. She could not read or write in any language. Her biggest fear was that she would be forgotten. There were many times that she dropped me off at college with my father, and I wanted her to come out of that car so that we could walk Carleton's grounds. Some of the trails were made after the deers, and I thought Grandma would so appreciate that. But every time I called for her to come out, she'd always say, when you graduate will be soon enough, Minai, when you graduate. And so I lived looking toward that day when I would graduate. February of 2003, just a few months before my graduation, my grandma passed away. She'd fallen down in Brooklyn Center, Minnesota, and I gone to her and I said, get up, Grandma, get up. She who had promised me that she would never die, because in Banbinai refugee camp, the place of my birth, a place that no longer exists because refugee camps are not meant to stand to the test of time. In this place where suicide was the #1 cause of death, where Hmong people were gone food 3 days a week. Surrounded by death, I cried for her to stay with me. And my grandma promised me to stop me from crying. She said, I won't die on you. I'll be with you until the road is through. And so that senior year of my college experience, I cried for her to stay. But my grandma told me that there were people who loved her before me. Not long ago, she had a mom and a dad, brothers and sisters, my grandfather, her most precious little girl. And that while there is no Hmong land in the map of a bigger world, she was going to climb this Hmong mountain in her heart. She was going to swing open the door to the house of her youth. Dinner would be ready. Everybody would be there. And they would look at her and they would say, why are you so late in coming home? My grandma's biggest fear was that she would be forgotten. When she died, my aunts and my mother went through her 13 suitcases because none of her children had a house with a room for grandma. So she carried 13 suitcases from one house to the other. They went through the 13th one. And to their surprise, it was full of letters. Letters for this woman who could not read or write. Letters written by my older sister Dao and me through all of the years when we were apart, when we lived in Minnesota and she lived in California. When Dao went to Kenya to study Kenyan philosophy. When I went to Thailand to try to find my way back to that place where I was born. We sent her postcards. I walked to this pile that they swept up in a corner, about to put into a trash bag. I picked up a postcard that I sent to my grandmother of my favorite Thai actor from Thailand, the man that I might one day marry if I were so lucky. I wanted her approval to see what she thought of him. I flipped the card over. My grandmother had read that postcard so many times that the ink had run off. All you could see was the indentations I made onto the page. In the months after she died, like it is now outside, the flowers were blooming, the trees were greening. Her favorite season, a season of growth, was coming. The world moved on as if Jolie had never lived. And so I began then what I thought would be my last and final love letter to my grandma. I wanted to tell her all of the things that I would never forget about her. How she used to put sugar on my tongue in an ice cube and tell me that that was cold and sweet coming together in the mouth of a child because we couldn't afford the quarters for the ice cream truck. How my grandma used to tell me when I made all of those wishes onto the high stars that I was doing it wrong, and that's why they weren't coming true. That I should send my wishes on the airplanes instead. That means that they are somewhere in the world waiting for me, that life will take me there. Such wisdom. But surrounded by wisdom without the experience to back it up, I do not know. And yet in this love letter, there were so many things I wanted to remember, and I wanted her to know that I would never forget. I was on page 37. There was a lot of things, people. But my dad asked me, "What are you doing, midnight?" And I told him, "I'm writing a love letter to my grandma." My father looked at me and he said, "Do you know that if you dream in the right direction, the dreamer never wakes up? The dream never dies. It always grows bigger and bigger." And so a different possibility opened up in my heart. Never mind that when I was in 7th grade, after a particularly hard day, when my mom came home with a throbbing migraine because we had overdrafted once again, trying to keep the roof solid, the cold out of our doors. I wrote in my journal, 7th grader at Murray Junior High. I pressed so hard that I ripped through the page. I said, "How does a writer become?" Big old question mark. On the next page, because the page was broken through, I wrote on the very bottom, in very tiny letters, "She keeps writing, period." I'm a senior, my grandma has just died. And I tell my mom and dad that I'm not gonna go to medical school, that I'm gonna go to writing school, and that I'm gonna learn how to write our stories, how to write her story into being, so that one day when I became an old woman, the world will remember her with me.
Yes, yes, yes.
My father, whenever he's worried, his thumbs do this. And they start doing this at the dining table, and he leans both elbows on, and the rickety table starts to shake. But my mom, in her fashion, looks at me and she says, "Of course, you've always loved stories." She hated telling me stories as a kid, because if she talked about a cat, I wanted to know how many eyes and whether they could walk and talk. I wanted to know everything. And she hated telling me these stories. But my father, who loved telling me stories, who's fed me on stories, whose poetry has shielded my siblings and me from the poverty of our lives. My father, who has always said that we are not poor children because our hearts are not poor.
Oh,
His thumbs are going around and around and around, and I look at him, and I don't shift my gaze. And my father tells me, he says to me, "If the sky that I live under can fall on me, if the earth that I walk on can throw me off, who am I to stand in your way?" So a different journey opened up. And I applied to writing schools, and because I was still a poor kid from the east side of St. Paul in a rotted house, 900 square feet, 2.5 bedrooms, a single bathroom, I didn't know how to pay for this school, this education. I knew that I was a victim of the semicolon and other grammatical structures. I knew that I needed an education, but how do you pay for an education you cannot afford? So I applied to fellowships and applied to schools. And my older sister, who's only a year and 9 months older than me, people, but she acts like she's the world older. She told me that life is like a ladder. If she's going to be the first here, I should be the second. She had stayed at Hamlin and pushed me to go to Carleton because she read somewhere that Carleton was the Harvard of the Midwest. She said that she would stay at Hamlin Law and become the lawyer that we needed, so that I could become a writer. Her only thing was that I had to apply to a school that I never dreamt of. I'm a kid raised in the housing projects of St. Paul, the McDonough Housing Project, the falling down houses on the east side of St. Paul. We don't dream of institutions like Columbia. I'd only ever seen New York via TV anyways, people. And the TV New York is not very much the New York in New York. But because she was my older sister and she had asked this of me, I applied. I got this interview with the Paul and Daisy Searles Fellowship for New Americans, the biggest graduate fellowship in the land. They would give you half of your tuition no matter where you went and give you a $20,000 living stipend a year. These finalist interviews were held in LA and New York, and so they flew me to LA. I was about 30 pounds lighter then, very, very tiny, and I never owned a suit. But my mom thought if I was going to go to this interview, I should have a suit. And so she had my dad take us to Rosedale Mall, and we went to the loft, and she found me a petite size suit that was still too big for me. We had no time to alter it, so we folded in the sleeves of the pant and the shirt. And there I was in LA at this fancy hotel. My roommate had placed in between us Glamour magazine, top 10 college women of the year, and she was on the cover. And so I was intimidated, way out of my element. This fellowship usually went to students from Stanford and Harvard, not small liberal arts colleges in the Midwest, people who wanted to pursue medicine and law, not writers. And so there I was. And they said red or white, and I thought white was water, so I said white. And then I tasted my first bit of white wine for the very first time. And people, we eat at home with mostly a spoon and then chopsticks when there are noodles involved, and I didn't know where to start with all the silverware. So I was still sitting there trying to look cool and trying to make sure that my sleeves didn't roll when the very first question of the finalists were asked. And it was asked of me, Kao Yang, because I dropped the part of Kalia because it took so much breath and so much air, and I grew up not speaking. I was a selective mute in English. And so it was Kao Yang, and they said, Kao Yang, is it true that wars bring on good things and that you are one of those examples? If not for that war in Laos, wouldn't you be on the high mountains of Laos with a baby on your back and a gardening hoe in your hand, not here dreaming of a way into writing? The only advice I've been given before these interviews was from my Uncle Ang. He says, you have to yell. Your voice is so soft, people won't hear you. So I'm yelling. I'm yelling and I'm saying, if that is how you feel, then I don't want your money. If I'm going to sit here and be an example that war, who's to say that the two who died so I could be here, that one of them would have been a better writer? Or that together the three of us would have conceived of a better way into writing? If that is how you feel, then I'll find a different way.
Wow, 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 wow.
The Harvard and the Stanford people did not help me out. Dead silence. And I thought, this is it. On the day we buried my grandmother, and you know, Hmong funerals are long. They're like 3 days, 24 hours a day, at least in the life before the pandemic. And so I come back from the funeral and I'm drained. And my roommate says, you have to check the answering machine. And I say, I'm too tired. And she says, no, you have to. And so I press play. The first was from Columbia University, Professor Liz Harris, saying that they had not only offered me a place in their program, but that they would give me one of their highest fellowships, half of my tuition paid. Half of my tuition is not the whole thing, you know, and I still didn't know how I would live, by food, by bread, by rice. The second message was from the Paul and Daisy Sorrells Fellowship for New Americans. And they say they would pay for half of my tuition anywhere I went and give me a $20,000 living stipend a year. On the day that my grandma's journey began, my own began. That is the reason why I stand before you today. I'm not a doctor. My mom and dad know this. But what I would do with words is no different than what I would do with medicine. I want to use them to heal. Heal not what is broken in the human body, but what is broken in the human heart.
Oh.
And so for the last 18 years, I'm 40 years old. I began writing my first book at 22. It came out when I was 27. For the last 18 years, I've been in pursuit of the human story, understanding that the call for peace is always collective.
Yes.
Knowing the human experience is individual, it is not unique. I have been on a long, long journey. From the very first, there were refugees from other communities asking, would you ever write our stories down? And I said, I can't, I'm too young. I'm still learning how to carry the emotions of my community. I need more time.
Yes.
And then finally in 2016, I knew that time was running out. And again, whenever I closed my eyes, I'd hear the words of my grandmother, who was a shaman, a medicine woman, and a healer, who had told me from when I was this high, that every time you have the power and the ability to help somebody, you have the power and the ability to hurt them. My grandma, who used to tell me that if I was ever to build a life, it would be because of my faith, not my fears. And so, in the midst of this administration that was anti-refugee, anti-newcomers, anti-poor, anti-so much of what I was, I sought out to put together a book in defiance of all of that, in support of the multitudes who were suffering, around the world, not just in our country. But I wanted to center it in our community right here in the Twin Cities. Many people don't know that Minnesota has more refugees per capita than any other state in the nation. We know that we're a predominantly white state, but we don't know that we're home to more Hmong, more Karen, more Somali, more Tibetan, more Liberian refugees than any other state in the nation. We are a place full of paradoxes. And so, November of 2020, after a new election, the election of Joe Biden, this book came out, Somewhere in the Unknown World. It is a collective refugee memoir, so an oxymoron right from the beginning. You know, memoir in this country has always been in the realm of the rich and the famous, generally white. But I am doing once again what I sought out to do. That very first book, the book of my grandmother's story, a book that I understand now was also me documenting Hmong American history, trying to crack the history books of memoir. You know, a family memoir. This is a collective refugee memoir. So I'm pushing myself all the way here. And I'm going to read that to you, different excerpts from different refugees across the Asian diaspora. Because I think there is no other way to honor the fact that we are together and that we are together for a reason. That we belong only because when you look at me, I belong to you.
Yes.
And you belong to me.
Yes. Oh.
Dedication. For the refugees from everywhere, men, women, and children, whose fates have been held by the interests of nations, whose rights have been contested and denied, whose thirst and hunger go unheeded and unseen. It begins with a poem by the great and my favorite American poet, Lucille Clifton. Quilting. Somewhere in the unknown world, a yellow-eyed woman sits with her daughter quilting. Some otherwhere, alchemists mumble over pots. Their chemistry stirs into science. Their science freezes into stone. In the unknown world, the woman, threading together her need and her needle, nods toward the smiling girl. Remember, this will keep us warm. How does this poem end? Do the daughters' quilt? Do the alchemists practice their tables? Do the worlds continue spinning away from each other forever? And we will begin with one of the most courageous, most unapologetic human beings I've ever met. This is an excerpt from Leaving with No Goodbye, Kao's story. Kao is Karen. Kao lives in these cities. And so I'm going to jump right in because good literature is not about information. It is about opening up human experiences and inviting others in. Right? So this is Kao's story. I saw what happened after a person died. Those who had loved them became less fearful, less careful, more recklessly brave. After my sister died, my mother and father were no longer afraid of the consequences. They moved us away from the Karen village I understood as home into the depths of the borderlands between Burma and Thailand to become resistance fighters. We children, like all people who could die, had to struggle for our lives. They said, "No one will fight your fights for you." I knew what my mother and father were fighting for, a Karen state. I learned the history of my people from my mother, a woman with broad bones and eyes just like mine, deep and dark, tempered fire. She had been a teacher and she raised me like a student. She told me about life for the 135 ethnic minorities in Burma, before the British came and what happened after. How the British set up a hierarchy in the country, and for once the ethnic minorities were seen as potentially powerful. She told me about 1948 when the British left and Burma became independent. She talked of how a military regime had taken over and set out to abolish the cultural centers and the traditional strongholds of the ethnic minorities. We, she instructed, my brothers and sisters and me, were born to take part in one of the longest running civil wars in modern history. She had given me a Burmese name to ensure my survival, should she and my father die and the protection of their arms be taken away. On Kwaso, but she made sure I knew that it was not my name. I changed my name after I heard the story. I decided that I did not need the shield of an oppressor to survive. I questioned whether I even needed my mother and my father's arms, for they were more interested in the national task and the work of letting us I chose for myself a Karen name. I became Kao Ta. In our language, Kao means country, and Ta means new. I would be a new country unto myself. And I'm going to skip a little bit ahead. In a refugee camp in Mae Sot, a district in western Thailand near the border, close to a village full of Burmese migrants and refugees, I enrolled in a medical training program. There I met the first woman who was not like my mother, and I fell in love with her for all the reasons I loved my mother. This woman stood out to me not because she was the most beautiful woman, but because she was the most fun. She was not part of a big history she could not forget. She was just trying to become educated so she could help herself. That singular focus drew me. Her wanting to be independent and live spoke to me. I was far from the adults in my life, so there was no formal marriage. We agreed to a loving union. I was too young and unconcerned with what might mean beyond a casual bedmate and a conversational partner. In Mae Sot district, surrounded by the lush jungles, close to a waterfall, I took my first step as a man. In my union with a woman who decided to dedicate her life to me, we had 3 children. 3 stateless children, citizens of no country, recognized by no nation. My beautiful baby boys were born with dark hair, skin the color of the earth. Their maternal grandfather, an old man who, like his daughter, belonged to the world as we knew it, not some imaginary place full of freedom, gave my sons the gift of poetry. Karen names calling on their worth. Lala Ka was the first. His name meant that he was worthy of a country. Lala Hok Ka was the second. His name meant that he was worthy of the earth. Lala Mu was the third. His name meant that he was worthy of the universe. I lived like a sun, and they revolved around me like planets, the women and children of the stratosphere. That is from a part of Kao's story. Now we move ahead, and you get to meet my mother, Jumo. Natalie's same old tired world. The woman lay on the sofa, her head on its leathery arm, her cell phone in her hand. She put on weight. With each breath, her stomach rose, a soft mound of flesh beneath her polyester shirt. She needed a haircut. Her black hair, kept short, had grown long, its strands covering her eyes like a teenage boy's. Her hair hadn't been this greasy since the years when she'd worked the night shift and then spent the days caring for her young children. She had used the time she had to wash her hair then for sleeping. She looked sluggish, sagging flesh and clothing, sitting on the sofa, her iPhone in her hands. The woman spent all of her time looking at flowers on the internet. She knew how to find and save the photos, flowers from everywhere, from around the world, the tulip fields of Holland, the orchids of Thailand, the beautiful Buddhist lotus ponds, the purple heathers abloom on the English moors. Once she saved the photos, she passed the days editing them, changing the filters and cropping the images. She had over 11,000 pictures on her phone. Sometimes she was afraid. She saw black things the size of cats move across the living room floor, her eyes frantic. She made no sound. Instead, she froze in place, her only movement, her eyes helplessly searching for an exit from her body. She had vivid dreams of handsome men who came into her life on horses. They all wanted to marry her and take her away. In the dreams, she wanted to go with them, except she couldn't quite lift herself off the ground and onto their high horses. Her body was heavy in the dreams, anchored firmly to the earth. Sometimes she woke up reaching for the handsome men, only to feel the empty, lonely air of their absence. She couldn't sleep at night without the drugs, even with them. During the days, she was tired, drowsy, had no heart for anything or anyone. Sometimes she cried for her dead father. It had been nearly half a century since his death, but to her it was fresh as the morning. She believed she knew where he was, always at the edge of the horizon. There he waited for her with wings like birds. He sent messages to her. He offered a promise to lift her up high so that they could soar through the skies together. From there, he told her, she would miss her children because she could still see them on earth. Most of the time, though, she spent her days on the sofa looking on her phone. She did not have the energy to cook or clean, two things she had always attended as a matter of life and death. In the past, no matter how little sleep she was functioning on, she made traditional meals for her family with no store-bought sauces and little fat. She boiled fish with lemongrass, tomatoes, green onions, cilantro, mint, basil, red hot chili peppers, a touch of MSG, and then salt to taste. She made bowls of rice with tofu and chicken soup. Her children loved her mung bean thread noodle with minced pork and green onions and cilantro, black pepper galore. As they ate, she would stand at the sink waiting to wash each plate, bowl, spoon, and fork. Now she herself was never hungry, and her children's hunger held no power to get her up. All of her life, no matter where they were, in the refugee camps or the housing projects, she and her husband's bedroom was a place where the bed was always made, the floor clean, clothes folded in baskets, hung in closets, stored in drawers. No matter the mess beyond its doors, the chaos of the unsteady world was never allowed to enter. Now she placed a blanket on the floor. The mountain of clean clothes that needed to be folded and put away was nearly as high as their crumpled bed. Now the dust of their lives had settled on her body and grown so thick she could barely move. At the doctor's office, the nurses gave her evaluations, worksheets designed to see if she was healthy or not. The questions asked if she was feeling any pain in her body. If yes, where? On a scale of 1 to 10, how much did she hurt? How often did she hurt? Was the pain less or more than at the last visit? The questions asked if she had any energy for the daily work of the living. Was she able to focus on a book or a television show? Was this more or less than at that last visit? Each time she answered the same, the doctors increased the dosage of her medication. When one prescription did not work, the doctor shifted to another. The woman was put on Wellbutrin, Prozac, Zoloft, Paxil, Effexor, Cymbalta, and more. One pill made her believe that she was on the cusp of death. Her heart started racing, she grew short of breath, she spoke her death wishes. Keep the funeral simple. I don't want my death to be complicated. At the doctor's office on the suicide question, she shook her head adamantly and said, my biggest fear is that I'll die and leave my children behind. I would never kill myself. This is Sigmuda and her mother's story. Sigmuda, for those of you who know artists in these cities, is a playwright and an author of children's books. Sigmuda can write her own stories. She shared her story and her mother's story with me because she wanted to see what her story would look like in my hands, in the hands of this writer. Sigmuda and I understand that what writers offer when they offer a look into lives is never a mirror. I'm not holding up a mirror. We all in this room know that mirrors break. When we go to the great museums, it is the portraits that stand. And so Sigmuda wanted to see the portrait that I might paint. And so this is their story, a burial and a birth. It was a different Christmas season. The children, Sigmuda and Arundeth, were both young and excited by the prospect of gifts. Sinuthith and her husband had to go to work on the pine farms outside the cities to ensure that the much-wanted gifts would be possible. She took deep breaths of the cold air scented by the cut pine. In the factory, with the bright lights overhead, she and her husband stood side by side along the edges of a work table. Around them, there were Hmong refugees, all doing the same work. Everybody was twirling pine leaves into wires, making Christmas wreaths. Her hands were thick and heavy with the dried sap from the trees. Her hands were rough and they were raw. The coldness she shivered from was replaced by incredible heat. The sun was burning down. She tugged at her shirt with heavy fingers. The fields of cucumber vines spread out before her, lines of prickly green leading to the very edge of the horizon. How long had they been picking the tiny cucumbers? The pain in her back was unbearable. They needed the extra money to buy school supplies for the kids in the fall. Little Sigmuda with her bangs cut across her forehead, and Arundeth, so eager to grow up and become a man, both hungry for fine shoes and the nice jackets. She'd once had fine shoes and nice jackets. She once lived in a place that was never freezing or burning hot. In the early mornings, along the French-style two-story houses beneath the tall trees, lines of young monks walked in the robes of the colors of the setting sun. They had a driver who took her each morning to the French school, where she and the other girls of her class learned about the history of Laos and the languages of the West. The girls played basketball for fun and wore pristine white shirts throughout the day. What would she have for lunch? To walk toward the vendor with the bowls of thick rice noodles in pork stock, or the sticky rice lady who sold banana-wrapped packages of steamed fish with spices. The thought of food made Sanutha unhappy. Her mouth was dry. She wanted water. No, she didn't. She didn't want anything. She wanted to sleep, to dream again. No sticky rice with steamed fish and herbs. No chili paste with pork skin. No soup with melon vines and dill and peppers. No water. Nothing, please. No more. No more killing. No more war. King Savan Batana, Queen Kampui, and Crown Prince Van Sathong had all been killed. They were now killing the governors one at a time. Oh no, what about my father? My father has left his children behind. All of us, my 6 brothers and sisters, my countless stepbrothers and stepsisters. He's fled on a boat for Thailand. From there, he's taken a plane to a place called Pomona, California. He sent a letter saying that we should all leave too. By the time the war was over, I had finished college. I'd been trained as a teacher. I was working as a supervisor on a dam project. In 1978, I met your father, Segmuda. Your father was a water buffalo gangster boy with some college but no degree. Arundheth, where is Arundheth? Where is my son, my good boy? The government was slowly seeking out and killing anyone affiliated with the old administration. They had begun interviewing neighbors and friends, keen on finding who my father's children were. We can stay and keep our baby boy Arundheth safe, Segmuda. Your father likes to say that we left Laos on a boat. He is wrong. We swam across the Mekong River. He doesn't remember like I do. Segmuda, we never drugged your brother on the run toward the refugee camp. Arundheth was such a good boy. He was 1.5 years old only. Each time there were soldiers nearby, all I had to do was pull him close and whisper, "Shh, don't make a sound." He listened to me. All of us made it out alive, and we didn't have to drug your brother Arundheth like so many others traveling with little ones. And you were born on December 24, 1981, in the refugee camp in Thailand, my beautiful baby girl, with my bones on her face, my shoulders, my arms, and my legs. My daughter who will one day become an athlete, not play basketball like me, but fall in love with volleyball, and become so good that she will get a scholarship to go to a college. You made me proud from the moment you were born, Segmuda. There was no little bird, little boy, little one who came after you. He was only 6 months old when he died in the refugee camp. I gave him a name with wings, and he flew away from me, from us, all of us. There's a bird chirping across the still winter's night. Is he calling for me? Segmuda, can you hear him calling for me, his mother and your mother? Segmuda, your birthday is coming. The day you were born is almost here. Segmuda's mother died before her birthday. That was the last thing I wrote in this book before I sent it to the publisher. Finally, I'm going to skip ahead and we're going to go to Tommy Sar, who's Cambodian American. Tommy was born here in Minnesota, but nobody knows it because Tommy was born with cerebral palsy, so Tommy's in a wheelchair. And when most people see him as a victim of Pol Pot and the Khmer Rouge. So a little bit from Tommy's story. Once, my father and I had gone on a drive together after school. It was a splendid autumn day in Minnesota, perfect hoodie weather. The sun was high and the sky was blue and the clouds were white and scattered in the direction of the wind. My father had picked me up from school. My teacher had gotten me ready, helping to secure my backpack to my wheelchair. When she saw my father walking our way, she said, "Mr. Sar, You have a smart one here. Tommy is a witty kid. The lines around my father's eyes fanned out with his smile. He said, yes, he is a smart kid. After school, my father drove us in our white and brown Buick, bought, used, but new to us, through the nice neighborhoods in Minneapolis. I watched the back of my father's head and the big houses on either side of the street from my place behind him. All the houses looked empty, but their lights were on, so we knew they were not empty. Just way bigger than the people inside of them. The trunks of the trees lining the streets were brown, a nice contrast against the grass still green from summer. The leaves were falling off the ash trees, raining yellow color like in a Korean drama. My father and I could have starred in a Korean drama about a loving father and his chill, wheelchair-bound son that day. I told my father that fall is my favorite season in Minnesota. I told him I loved the smell of the dry leaves in the air. I asked him what his favorite time of the year was when he was a boy like me. My father told me that when he was a boy in Cambodia, he loved the ending of the monsoons and the beginning of the dry seasons. He said the grass and the trees were rather luscious then. The earth gave off its own smell, not at all like dry leaves, but a smell like the dirt itself was blooming. I asked my father if he ever thought he'd leave Cambodia when he was a boy. He asked me if I thought I'd ever leave Minnesota. We both shook our heads. When we got to our house in Minneapolis, we both let out a sigh. It'd been a nice drive. Home was where we needed to be, but neither of us really wanted to go in. Except there was no time to linger, because our front door opened and we saw one of my father's best friends waving. My father carried me inside. His friend greeted us by opening the screen door and then leading the way to the living room. My father set me up in front of the television. He went to the kitchen and grabbed beers for his friend and himself. His friend, a short guy who dressed like a teacher from the past, in a button-up shirt and slacks, asked, "Hey, Tommy, what do you want to be when you grow up?" I looked at my father when I answered, "A naval engineer like my father was in Cambodia." The friend clapped me on the shoulder. "Good boy." My father said, Tommy is really smart at school. He can be anything he wants. A lawyer, a judge, anything at all. Just for fun, I asked, what if I want to be an astronaut one day? My father laughed out loud. Then you will be an astronaut one day. We both knew there were no astronauts in wheelchairs, but I liked that he said I could be one. He always tried to support everything positive I had to say about myself or the world we lived in. And then the very back of Tommy's piece. Tommy is sent without knowing to California, and he's sentenced there for 10 years. So he becomes a refugee in a very different context. Later that night, I had California aunt call my father for me. Our conversation was short. My father said, "How are you, son?" I said, "I miss you." He sobbed, "I miss you too." I wanted to lash out at him, but I could not. I had been in this situation before. When I was a kid, my father used to take me to all the specialists in the Twin Cities trying to treat my dystrophy. At one place, they gave me electric shock therapy. I remember lying in the bed with electrodes and crying with every shock the doctors administered. One time, I heard my brother Sam outside the room talking with our father. Sam asked, "Why is Tommy crying? What's wrong?" Our father answered in a sobbing voice, "It's to help him. It is not bad. It is to help him." I remember that after I heard the cry in my father's voice, I quieted my own. I said, "I'll see you soon." He sobbed once again, "I miss you." I heard everything I needed in those words. His love, always his love, his optimistic love, a belief that one day we would be reunited. Perhaps when that day came, I could be the astronaut of our dreams. Not just the disabled son of a Cambodian refugee struggling to make a normal life for himself and his family in Minnesota. I accepted that we couldn't help what we were, him and me, and that neither of us was ever going to go home again, that we would never return to our favorite seasons. That is Tommy Sarr's stories. These are just a few of the stories in this book. Again, this is a collective refugee narrative with stories from around the world. I wrote the book because I believe what Mr. Michael said. Mr. Michael, an Eritrean refugee in this book, he says that peace is possible. Peace is possible if we hold on to the good stories, not just the bad. I believe that what I write when I go to the page are not only the good stories, I'm looking for the great stories. Sometimes people look at me and they say she's a Hmong American refugee talking only about the Hmong American experience. Sometimes people look at me and they say she is a refugee and she is talking about refugees only. How wrong they are. Like all the great writers before me, it is the pulse of humanity that I'm trying to feel when I go onto the page.
Yes.
It is the pulse of humanity that we feel beating when we collect together like this to honor each other's stories, to make room, to say we see you, we hear you, we honor you. Thank you to all of you for being here and having me. For those of you watching virtually, thank you, everyone.